Welcome to Weird Stuff in the Bible, where we like to explore scripture passages that are bizarre, perplexing, or just plain weird. And today we're not necessarily going into a Bible study. We have a special guest who is joining us once again, Brian Godawa. He's the author of the Chronicles of the Nephilim series, which we talked about a few months ago here on the podcast. And today we're going to be talking about one of his new releases in a different series that he has called Chronicles of the Watchers. And so, hey, Brian Godawa, it's really a pleasure to have you back with us.
Thanks for having me on, Luke.
Yeah, I heard a lot of people really interested in what you had to say last time, and we have been really in a lot of Nephilim stuff and pre-flood
Yep.
world, and I know a lot of that is part of your interest too, and you wrote that series on where the Nephilim came from and all that. But the Chronicles of the Watchers is about stuff that takes place after the flood, and I just thought I might start by just like, what is that series all about? What's your kind of like vision of how all this spiritual warfare plays out in the world that I guess that we live in today?
Sure. Well, Chronicles of the Watchers is a series that I started as a spin-off from Chronicles of the Nephilim, which was my best-selling series of stories from the Bible, retold, David, Abraham, etc., but with a particular focus on the spiritual warfare motif, on the supernatural watchers and Nephilim, the giants, and that kind of stuff. So it's sort of bringing out the like pulling back the curtain and seeing what might the spiritual world look like during these Bible stories. We get glimpses of it in the Bible, but not hardly any at all, right?
Mhm.
Other than the visions and dreams, but I mean, like, what's really going on? So, Chronicles of the Watchers is sort of it's an integrated with Chronicles of Nephilim, because after I finished that series, I realized there's still more stories to tell. So, I've got there's standalone novels, whether it's Moses against the gods of Egypt, or Jezebel, Harlot Queen of Israel, or the new trilogy, Daniel. Um, they're standalone. You can read them alone, but they're also integrated into the whole series. And if you read the whole series from Nephilim to Watchers to Chronicles of the Apocalypse, you can go on my website, and I give the page of, I have a website page of all the books in chronological order, so you know how to read them, because there is a continuity between them. That is, in the spiritual realm, you've got the same angels and fallen angels and demons and archangels, and they, of course, are the same throughout all the stories. And so there's a link going on there, even though we're focusing on different Bible heroes at different times and
Right.
different periods. So
Hundreds or thousands of years apart.
yeah, so the new book is actually a trilogy, and the first book is Daniel, Exile in Babylon, and it's basically, I'm retelling the story of Daniel. And it's interesting because one of the premise of the Chronicles of the Watchers is telling the story of these spiritual principalities over nations and peoples, and how the wars on earth reflect the wars in heaven, because that's how the Bible sees it, right? And of course, one of the premier passages on that very topic is in Daniel. And I'd never told Daniel's story before, and yet one of the premier passages is in Daniel. Well, in Daniel 4, we hear about the Watchers.
Hmm.
They are this spiritual heavenly host. They give decrees. They have authority that's below Yahweh's authority, but they have an authority over humanity, and they give them decrees. And then in Daniel 10, we read about the spiritual princes of Persia, the prince of Greece, and the prince of Israel, Michael. And in that storyline, we see that there's a reflection of. Now, most scholars will tell you that these are not earthly princes. The earthly rulers would be called kings and such. But these are spiritual princes over the nations. So the prince of Persia is the principality over Persia, right?
Hmm.
So when Daniel's talking about the prince of Persia, fought against Michael and stuff, that has to do with what's historically going on right then and there, related with Babylon and Jerusalem and all that. But then he talks about how later on in chapter 10, he talks about how, but the prince of Greece is coming against the prince of Persia, right? Well, what's that
Hmm.
about? Well, if you read Daniel, Daniel's all about the coming Gentile kingdoms that would rule over Israel. So the operating paradigm there is that Babylon, then Medo-Persia, then Greece, then Rome will ultimately rule over over Israel, and it prophesies these coming kingdoms, right? So when it's talking about Prince of Greece coming against Prince of Persia, that matches up with historically
Hmm.
what would happen shortly after them, which is Alexander the Great of Macedonian Greece. He would conquer the known world, but he would also overcome Persia. And so you see here how what's happening in the earthly realm of history is reflected in the heavenly realm. So that's one of the main principles of all my stories. And so in Daniel, Exile in Babylon, I'm telling the story of how when Daniel goes into exile, I'm also telling the spiritual world story as well. In other words, what is the Prince of Babylon doing? And the premise of all my series is, what if the gods of the ancient world, right? Like in Babylon, it was Marduk and
Hmm.
Ishtar. In Egypt, it was Amun-Ra and Horus, right? In Canaan, it was Baal and Asherah. What if these gods of the ancient world were not just mythology, but they were based on actual demonic spiritual beings?
Right.
And of course, the Bible does hint at this in several places. One is Deuteronomy 32, I think verse 17, talks about how when the Israelites went into Canaan and they worshiped the false gods of Canaan, it
Hmm.
says they worshiped demons that were not God. And the word demon is not quite what we understand it in the modern world, but it's similar.
It's
But
a
it's
shadim right there, isn't it?
Shadim, exactly. And the Shadim were considered territorial spirits or powers
Hmm.
that everyone in the ancient world tended to believe, right? So the Bible has this picture as well. And so I said, what if these gods of the ancient world were actually these fallen angels that the Bible talks about in Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 10?
Hmm.
The sun God at Babel, he splits the nations through language, and then he places them under the authority of these sons of God. And sons of God in the Bible are spiritual beings from heaven,
Hmm.
come to earth. They're fallen. Man is worshiping, Gentile nations worship, demonic entities, basically, right? And so
Right.
I kind of made this connection. What if they were those beings, those angels masquerading as Marduk and such? And so it's not a one-to-one correspondence, but it's something like that. And so in my Daniel story, then I have Marduk and Nabu and Ishtar and some of the Babylonian deities. As Babylon is taking over the world at that time, so those deities, those divine rulers
Hmm.
headed by Marduk, so they are jockeying for power and conflicting and battling with the spiritual powers of Egypt and the
Hmm.
spiritual powers of Canaan, right?
Hmm.
So that's the picture that all my novels tell, and this one in particular focuses, of course, on Babylon because that's where Daniel is, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
So that's the spiritual world of the stories that is also in Daniel. Now, this first novel, and by the way, if people really love reading series, don't wait till all the other books are out. This book, Daniel, Exile in Babylon, is a standalone novel. It has a beginning, middle, and end, and I tell the story of Daniel's first 3 years in the school of the Magi, or the school of the wise men, and that, of course, is what happens in Daniel 1. So it only covers Daniel 1, but the rest of the books will cover more time period. But
Hmm.
what I wanted to do was I wanted to, when I first was approaching this, I thought, the whole premise of Daniel being taught these, astrology and divination and all this stuff. And he became 10 times better than all the Babylonian magicians. And I thought, how could that be? Because he was a obedient Jew, a Torah observant Jew, and God basically, forbid astrology and such. So how did he survive? And then how did he become so good
Hmm.
such that he got appointed by the king, right? And I wanted to wrestle through that issue because that's sort of the setting for the rest of the Daniel story. And also, how did Daniel become this man, a young man of conviction that we all know him to be? The man who's willing to die rather than disobey God, right? We
Right.
don't start out perfectly, and he's maybe 50, he's like 15 years old when this story begins. And so I wanted to tell that story of how did he become this young man of conviction, and because we're all sinners, right? And we all start out at a certain place until we grow and become that mature.
Hmm.
And so that was sort of the goal behind it. But it tells a beginning, middle, and end, and it's a very exciting plot. And there's an action adventure and also romance. I also have a love story in there with Daniel and a fellow Jewish girl who's actually in Jerusalem. And so I bounce back and forth between Jerusalem and Babylon and how these two are trying to come together.
Hmm.
And it's a very exciting story that I had the time of my life writing it. And in fact, my editor and my first readers are saying this is my best book yet.
Well, and you actually sent me a copy of the trailer, so I'll just go ahead and play that here if that's all right.
What if the gods of ancient Babylon were not myths, but fallen angels? You know the Bible story of Daniel, a faith empires cannot break, but you've never experienced it like this. The Daniel Trilogy by best-selling author Brian Godawa, part of the Chronicles of the Watchers, a series of supernatural biblical novels charting the influence of spiritual warfare on human history. Jezebel, Moses, Judah Maccabee, and now the Daniel Trilogy. The first novel, Daniel, Exile in Babylon, available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook at Amazon.com. Chronicles of the Watchers by Brian Godawa at Amazon.com.
Yeah, so I want to reiterate what you said a moment ago that, it might say at the top book 6 in the Chronicles of the Watcher series. Since we last talked, I've been reading through the Chronicles of the Nephilim series. When this Daniel book came out, I just went ahead and started into it. And you can just start right into this book and start reading Daniel's story. And I'll cut this out if this is a spoiler, but one thing that I thought was really cool, I was not expecting this, was it's not just about Daniel, but that you have the prophet Jeremiah, who lived at the same time as Daniel. So we're getting to see a little bit of his story too. And
Yes.
then there's
You can
also, oh, go ahead.
You can keep that in.
Okay.
Yeah, because one of the things that always intrigued me about the Exile, I've always wanted to go deeper into the Exile and learn more about it. And I'd heard that there was other prophets in that time period, and Jeremiah was, and so was Ezekiel, by the way, and so were a couple others. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. Did they know each other? Did they interact? And this whole exile is a very crucial turning point in the history of Israel. And it also, Babylon becomes a focus of the definition of evil for the rest of the Bible after that. So in other words, whenever, a prophet or someone, wanted to, call someone evil, they would call them Babylon. And I thought, well, even though the story's Daniel, if Jeremiah is at that same time, and he overlaps, that's interesting. So that's one of the reasons why I bounce back and forth between Jerusalem, because Jeremiah stayed in Jerusalem, continued to prophesy, he had been prophesying about the destruction of the city for decades. And that's one of the reasons why he was suicidal, because he was so depressed that nothing ever happened and everyone just kept, cursing him. And God just kept telling him, well, they're not going to believe you, but go ahead and tell them anyway. That's pretty depressing, right?
Yeah, it's a depressing story.
Yeah, in fact, there's a couple passages in Jeremiah where he talks about this suicidal mentality that Jeremiah had, and that I found fascinating. So I delve into that, and then the other component was the three Jewish comrades of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We know them by their Babylonian names, right? But
Right.
The Bible says nothing about them, just that they wouldn't worship the statue, so they got thrown in the fire. But we don't know anything about them. And I find that to be very interesting. Like, he has these three friends, they're going through life, they're young, they start out, and they're going through school together. I'm thinking, okay, I have to go into these characters. They're like a little brotherhood, right? And I kind of saw it as Harry Potter meets God. Daniel's going to this school to learn how to be a magician, right? And only he's with God, and it's God interacts with this world.
Yeah.
but I gave each of them different characters, and I made them, it's fiction because we don't know anything about them, but it's consistent with the overall picture of what we do know of Daniel.
Hmm.
And just as just one little spoiler alert, but it's something to look forward to. I won't tell everything, but one of the characters of Daniel's friends I have as an autistic young man.
Hmm.
So, but his autism becomes a struggle in a way for them, but it also becomes God uses it as a means to actually rescue them and to bring about some great things in the story. So look for that as well. There's a lot of interesting takes on this. My goal is to be as consistent with the book of Daniel, what we do know about the book of Daniel, but to fill in the holes or in between with fiction that will connect with and make sense of what we do know in the book of Daniel.
Yeah, and your books do have fictional elements to a certain extent, but also, if people read these, they're going to glean a lot of historical information and learn things about like what was going on in the world, real life history.
Yeah, one of my goals, one of my loves is I love history and I love research. But one of my goals is to retell these stories, but rooted in a lot of historical research, because, and that includes also the mythological side of things. And I'll explain that in a second. But so yeah, in this story, for instance, we know that in history, King Nebuchadnezzar became king when his father died, while Nebuchadnezzar was out in the Levant, actually conquering Israel too. But and so he had to go back to receive the kingship. But right before that, he defeated the city of Carchemish. This is a historical thing. It's not in the Bible, but it's historical, and it's really, really relevant to the story because that marked the final ending of the Assyrian Empire and the rise of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. His father began it, but Nebuchadnezzar finalized it. And that's really key for the setting of where Israel is, right? And so I tell that story, that part of the story. And I just found some fascinating little tidbits of facts and interesting cultural things about the time period that I always try to incorporate because it gives you a sense of like you're really there, or you're learning things about history. Oh, I didn't know that happened. So yeah,
Right.
I want to make it consistent that way, but also I like to bring in a little bit of education on the mythology of that world. So, for instance, Babylon had a lot of myths, right? They had a creation epic, they had myths surrounding their gods. So what I do is I bring in some components from the real mythology, and I incorporate those into the story of the spiritual world. What's going on in the spiritual world? So, for example, there's a whole story of you know it, Marduk
Hmm.
going after this giant cherubim, like not cherubim, kind of like a yeah, kind of like an ancient cherubim, but it's a Babylonian version, and it's this Anzu bird who's like a huge bird, like an crossed with an eagle and a lion and a snake for a tail. And anyway, it steals this special tablet of the destinies, and the tablet of destinies in their mythology was the sort of like the ring of power. It was the thing that the controlling god would control, and Marduk had that, and it basically it's like a living document that would contain every year. It would contain what was the future of the gods, and that's how he controlled them, right? And so the story is that this Anzu bird steals that tablet, so Marduk has to hunt him down and get it back. So, that's a part of the mythology, but in the spirit, what if this was, in the spiritual world, what if there, we don't know what kind of demonic beings there are in the spiritual world, right? So I retell some of those mythologies, but I keep it within that realm of the spiritual world. So when you're seeing the story of these spiritual entities, you're not just seeing a reflection of what's going on in the historical world. You're also getting an education a bit on the very religious worldview of, for example, the Babylonians or the Egyptians.
Yeah, yeah. So that brings me to the kind of the third track that the book takes. So you got the Daniel story, you got the Jeremiah story going on in Jerusalem, but you also kind of pull back the veil and show what could have been happening behind the scenes spiritually, like how all these the Watchers, these spiritual beings, were a lot of times in conflict, and it seems like kind of trying to step on each other's head and dominate in the spiritual realm. And
Yeah.
so that's kind of the backbone of this whole Chronicles of the Watchers series, isn't it?
Yeah. And my premise is this. It's like, we tend, or at least I tended to think of the demonic, evil spiritual world as just sort of this unified mass of evil, right? All these demons or all these beings, and they're all fighting Yahweh, so it's like they're an army and they're all unified.
Right.
But you know what? The Bible very clearly says that these are beings of individual personalities. They are individuals, just like we are. They're spirit beings. They're different, or the angels are different kinds of beings, the fallen angels, right? And by the way, fallen angels are not the same as demons. That's a whole other issue. But the fallen angels have personalities. So I thought, well, you know what? If they're evil and sinful, even if they are united in their attack against Yahweh, we all know that evil people, evil organizations, everyone within that organization fights with each other and tries to betray each other to get to the top, right? So like
Yeah.
imagine the mafia. The mafia has a unified purpose in a way, but
Right.
they're all fighting to become the chief.
Yeah.
And so I have that in these stories as well. They're not a unified in every way. They've definitely got their own dramatic, like I said, drama of betrayal and power as well.
Yeah, and so do you think that they all have to answer to Satan, or can they just do their own thing? And I ask this because there is that verse where Jesus said in the New Testament that a house divided against itself cannot stand, and so I think that is what gives a lot of us the impression, oh, they must all be united together. But how does the devil play into all of that?
Well, that's a good question. The Satan is a very interesting figure. I've done all kinds of like little studies on that. By the way, one of the things I do with all my books is I tend to also release a research book that you can also buy along with the novel if you want to know more about the biblical and historical research. Now, the one for Daniel is called The Spiritual World of Daniel in Babylon. It's not out yet because I got to wait till the second book comes out, then I'll release that. But I usually tend to release it with the novels. So I explain some of that in the book. But basically what you have is the Satan is not quite as simple as we see him now in our day, even with our post New Covenant ways. In the Old Testament, he's more depicted like a member of God's heaven. It's not like he's like this evil guy running around, defying God. He may be defying God, but he's actually like the prosecutor in God's heavenly court. He's the one who comes, because the whole situation is forensic. It's legal. God has a covenant, which is a legal document with Israel. When Israel breaks it, she has to be punished, but there has to be a court that determines that. And so the Satan is the one that comes and accuses. That's where the word accusation comes from. The adversary or the accuser is the Satan. So he's a negative character, but I'm just saying he's really kind of a part of God's purposes. Well, God controls everything anyway, but then in the New Testament, it becomes a little bit more clarified and a little bit more focused. And because I think that there are watchers over these nations, like in the Bible, Satan's not the only one. And I don't necessarily see him as being the ultimate guy. He may be, he may be the most powerful one. I tend to picture him that way because that's our traditional view. But I don't know that that's the case. But by the time of the New Testament, what I've done in my series is I've made Satan be the watcher of Rome, so that he's got power. And of course, if you look at history, power goes back and forth between all these nations. But ultimately, by the time of Messiah, Satan since he's the watcher of Rome, when Rome controls the world, Satan's the one in control. So in other words, when Babylon controls the world, then the watcher of Babylon is the chief guy. See how it rises with the nations.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I played it out in the series. But I do always have him as a powerful figure in the background that everyone has awe. Because why? Because he's the only one who's in the court, the divine court of God, who actually he knows the Torah and he knows the law. He's the one that accuses Israel of violating the law, and therefore they must be punished, type of thing. So that's kind of how I depict it in context.
Right, right. The books that I've read, yeah, just like you said, he's in the background a lot. And I noticed like Satan is what I would say suspiciously absent from the book of Enoch and what it tells us about the sons of God who rebelled before the flood. But I feel like
Yeah.
he must have had probably, pulling strings behind the scenes or something like that. I'm sure he had something to do with it but he knew where he could toe the line and stay out of trouble with God in a legal sense, so he didn't get banished along with the rest of those when they got in trouble.
You make an excellent point there. That's a very excellent point. You're right. And that's why you be careful not to assume things change over time and things change between covenants. So be careful not to assume that the way things are now in the post New Covenant time, that's not necessarily the way things were before. So yeah, your point is well taken.
Yeah, and I had another question too. I wanted to ask about end times because you brought up end times a moment ago, when perhaps Satan is like the principality over Rome. So in Revelation, we see I guess the government of the Antichrist depicted as this beast, and it's got part leopard and part lion, and it seems to bring in all these things like Persia from the past and Babylon from the past. Do you think that maybe at that time all these watchers do decide, we're pretty close to the end here, maybe we all do need to actually band together and try to stop the second coming of Christ? Is that how you kind of see that playing out in the end times?
Well, so I have a very different view of the end times than the typical sort of premillennial or dispensational or left behind or whatever, However, if we just try to stick to be like, when was the book of Revelation fulfilled? Was it in the past or in the future and all this? But if we just stick to the text, I do believe, yes, that the watchers, that their ultimate demise is tied in with what occurs in the book of Revelation. The question is, when does it occur? Now, I'm not going to go into it here, but my series, Chronicles of the Apocalypse, which is a standalone series as well, and the first book is Tyrant, Rise of the Beast. I tell the story of the origin story of the book of Revelation. When John was writing it, the Christians are being persecuted under Nero, that kind of stuff. And I try to show how the Christians in the first century might have understood that book in their day. But yeah, but now we're bouncing back to the judgment of the watchers. Now, I just want to point this out. I don't know when this is going online, but I'm going to be speaking at a virtual conference called The Unseen War with Kyle Milholland. And that's coming up. I should have the date in front of me. I'm going to write that down. Sorry about that. But look for the Unseen War Conference online. And I'm going to be talking about the judgment of the watchers. When are the watchers judged? Now, I believe that the key to understanding it begins in Psalm 82. Psalm 82 is a good summary of the whole watcher paradigm and how, God appoints these sons of God over the nations, and they rule. They're supposed to rule, but they rule unjustly. So God says he's going to punish them, and they're going to die. They're immortal beings who are going to die. So the death is a punishment that's going to be, I'm going to make you die like humans die, right? That kind of thing. And then it talks about how then God will inherit the nations. Arise, O God, judge the nations, and you will inherit the nations. So the inheritance that the Gentile, Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 9 talks about the inheritance of the Gentiles are these sons of God, these gods of the nations. And so when does God take back those territories and inherit those nations? Well, I believe that's rooted in the resurrection and ascension of Jesus Christ as Messiah. He's the one that disinherits the watchers so that they're no longer in power over those nations through his resurrection and ascension. And then that's what enables the gospel to go forth. People are no longer blinded. People are no longer in bondage to these authorities, right? They can now submit to the authority of Christ, and all tongues and tribes and nations are going to come to Christ. I don't want to go down the off path of Daniel here, but like I said, check out the Unseen War Conference and see if you can. It's a pretty affordable conference to get on, and I talk more about that in detail.
Okay, yeah, And one more question here, and then I'll let you tell people where they can find Daniel. But I was just curious too. So I haven't got very deep into Daniel yet. Once these gods, like I know you have some origin stories for where some of them come from in the books, but if they were if they were one of the Watchers of God, and then they've fallen, they've rebelled against him, they're just trying to do their own thing now and exalt themselves. Are they still on the council? Like, are they still invited to a seat at the table, or are they cast out?
That's a very good question. I have them as capable. Sometimes in some of my novels, I'll have a scene in the divine council, the spiritual divine council in the heavens, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I sometimes will have them show up. Yeah.
Okay.
In other words, like God can allow anything, into his courtroom, right?
Yeah.
And if the accuser's allowed in there and such, and sinners are allowed in there,
Right.
As has happened the case. In fact, prophets are allowed in there, and prophets are sinners, right? So I believe that they can be. Are they regularly? I don't know. There's not much of a picture of that
Mm-hmm.
in the text. But Psalm 82, obviously, God sits in the council, in the divine council of the gods, and he talks to these watchers. So there certainly is some times in which they are there.
Yeah. Okay.
And I do depict that.
Yeah, that's why I call it weird stuff in the Bible. What I do, because that's really weird that they would get to still be invited up there, especially the devil.
Our assumption is, of course, as good Christian evangelical Christians, like God won't allow sin into his presence, right?
Right.
Well, that's in a relational sense, that's true. But of course, God's presence is everywhere, and God's presence is around sinners all the time.
Mm-hmm.
You could say that God won't allow it in his presence for eternity, that kind of a thing, because that's what he tells us. But God can allow sinners into his presence. And of course, this is the divine courtroom too. This is not like his holy reside or whatever.
Right.
It's so as a forensic element, as a courtroom, as a legal courtroom, of course you can have bad guys in there.
Yeah, right. Well, hey, I really appreciate, Brian Godawa, all the time that you gave us tonight. The clock's running out on me here. I don't know if you can see that, but tell people real quick, where can they find your books? Where do you send them if they want to learn more?
Well, all my books are exclusively at Amazon in Kindle, paperback, audiobook, large print. I try to do that for all the novels. And so you can get them all exclusively there. But if you want to know more information about them and such, there's a lot at my website. It's Godawa.com, my name, Godawa, Godawa.com. And I do something really cool on there. If you look up each of the individual books, you find them. There's a little bar that says cast of characters. And you go there and you can see I've cast all my novels as if they were movies. And so most of my main characters are in there. And you can kind of see how I envision them as I'm writing it.
Okay, yeah, so people can check that out. And I also pulled up that Unseen War conference. That's going to be the 25th of April. If people want to go look at that.
April 25th, I got to remember that.
theword@warmedia.com. That's where people can see about passes to that. So,
yeah.
Hey, I just want to say real quick, too, I love that interview we did a few months ago. And then I've listened to some interviews with you since then, talking about other things online. And what I love is you have so much enthusiasm for what you write about and what you talk about. And that's just really even infectious. Like, it just gets me excited hearing the excitement in your voice. So you definitely love what you do. And I just appreciate that and your time sharing about it.
You bet.